Okay, so we are entering the third and final section of today's symposium on climate change, landscapes on the edge. For those who are just joining, I'd like to take a moment to say how grateful we are to the museum, to MOCA, for taking a step in this direction. It's the first broad symposium on climate change in a U.S. art museum, looking at the history, the social causes, the current effects, and the future solutions. So really thank you to MOCA. The director here, Johanna Burton, came in and just only a short bit after we started the Environmental Council. And one of her first things she said was, I really want to focus on this and I want to participate. And she attends all of the Environmental Council meetings. She has just been an exceptional steward. And one of the things we're finding with climate work is that it needs to be everyone. It needs to be the registrars, it needs to be the curators, the directors. It's really a community effort. And from my experience as an artist who is a volunteer, being involved with this museum, I have seen it be a collective effort. And it's really that kind of partnership that allows all of us to learn and to do better. And it's a real experience. You know, there's ups and downs. And I've just seen this museum be a bastion of both humility, but also strength in internal changes and experiences like this, which are supporting the local community in education and in sharing. And I think Johanna's here today. Oh, there she is. Thank you, Johanna. Exceptional person. And she's sitting with Lisa Mark. And Lisa, we want to thank you for all of your support bringing this program forward, with the sharing of it, with the communications, and your advising throughout. So thank you. In moving into the last section on strategies or solutions, we are going to listen to 4 presentations that will hit close to home. They'll also be, frankly, very optimistic, because one of the things we do in this field is we wouldn't do it if we're not optimistic. So I welcome you to get excited. I welcome you to challenge. I welcome you to bring forward your ideas. Thank you so much for texting in the questions. That's been awesome. Ed Barbier is a university distinguished professor in the Department of Economics at Colorado State University and a senior scholar in the School of Global Environmental Sustainability. His main expertise is environmental and resource economics, as well as international environmental policy. Ed's a great guy. He has authored over 350 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, written or edited 27 books, and published in popular journals and social media. His latest book is the award-winning Economics for a Fragile Planet by Cambridge University Press. Ed, where's Ed? There we are. Okay, Ed's going first. Aradhna Tripati researches and teaches about climate change, the history and dynamics of changing Earth systems, including ice sheets, oceans, the water cycle, carbon dioxide levels, and clumped isotope geochemistry, which I'm looking forward to learning about. She is a tenured professor in the Institute of the Environment and Sustainability, the Department of Atmospheric and Oceanic Sciences, the Department of Earth and Planetary and Space Sciences, and the Institute for Geophysics and Planetary Physics at the California Nanosystems Institute at UCLA. Her work is interdisciplinary. Justin Winters is the co-founder and executive director of One Earth, focusing on the twin crises of biodiversity and climate. She's the co-founder of the Global Safety Net, which you'll learn about today. And prior to One Earth, Justin served as executive director of the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. She built the organization's grant-making program, which awarded over $100 million in grants across 60 countries and created a series of innovative philanthropic funds. Justin is one of our landscape heroes, and it's a pleasure to have her. Dr. Peter Kalmus is a climate scientist at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. He is the recipient of NASA's prestigious Early Career Achievement Medal with over 100 peer-reviewed scientific publications. As an activist, Peter was the first US organizer of Fridays for Future. He co-founded Earth Hero, the world's most popular climate app, and he co-founded the Climate Ad Project, which is the first ad agency for the Earth. Peter also rarely travels. This is, I think, his first flight since 2012, and so we're very, very lucky to intersect with his travel. To begin the strategies section, I'm going to welcome Ed Barbier to do his presentation.
Thank you very much. I really appreciated this chance to come and this invitation from MOCA to speak to you all, and I appreciate everyone coming to hear me talk. And I'm looking forward to our panel, so that's a really distinguished panel. So let me just start by kind of recapping what we've heard, particularly what Dr. Ramanathan was saying, if you were here for his opening address. Basically, right now, we consume about 80% of our energy from fossil fuels, 20% from renewables and other sources. Meanwhile, we're on trajectory with climate change to go well beyond 1.5 degree warming, but probably 2 to 3 degree. Every time we go up another half degree or even quarter degree, the type of damages we're going to face are more immense and bigger and more catastrophic, potentially catastrophic. Equally, to reduce fossil fuels, to transition from fossil fuels from, let's say, 20% renewables and others to 80%, so we're only down to 20% fossil fuels. Each time we raise 20%, it's going to cost us more and more and more. And so the key thing to all this, and my main message to you, is, as I expressed in my recent book, is that we're not going to make this transition from fossil fuels to low carbon energy very quickly to avoid catastrophic climate change unless we address a fundamental problem in our economic system, which is the underpricing of fossil fuels. And the way to address that is through carbon pricing. So why does underpricing of fossil fuels matter? Well, it's really simple. Cheap fossil fuels have blunted the need for change. The reason we find it more expensive to go from 20% non-fossil fuels to 40% and beyond is because we are artificially changing the playing field to make fossil fuels a cheaper alternative, and that's preventing the innovation we need, the incentives we need, and the investments we need to make this transition away from fossil fuels. And so what I mean by carbon pricing is carbon taxes or tradable permits, which means that the emitters of carbon pay for the damages from climate change. It also means phasing out fossil fuel subsidies, which are the payments we make to have additional exploration, production, and consumption of fossil fuels. And then also what we need is internal carbon pricing by businesses. Businesses are increasingly seeing that climate risks are business risks, and they need to start accounting for these climate risks through imposing a price on carbon in their operations and investments. Now, why is this important? Well, we already know as economists have started to total up what is underpricing costing us. And there was a study done by the International Monetary Fund that showed that the underpricing of carbon associated with producing and burning coal, oil, and gas amounted just in the United States in 2020 about $660 billion, which translates into $2,000 per person. And you can see here I've broken it down into the various components. You know, there's the producer and other explicit subsidies. But the main damages and costs are from climate change, vehicle congestion, accidents, death and sickness from local air pollution, and tax revenue losses. Now, this was in 2020, and it's a serious underestimate even for that year because we don't have the sort of costs and damages we heard in the last session from heat waves or mental illness or people who are affected by their houses burning and increasing floods. But since 2020, we know we're now into a climate crisis where these damages have multiplied probably 3 or 4-fold. Witness the recent hurricanes, the wildfires across the West, droughts, flooding, and so forth. So I would suggest that we're now in a range of about $4,000 to $5,000 per person at a minimum. So what do we need to do? Well, what we need is a low carbon transition strategy where we, first of all, get rid of or phase out producer and other explicit fossil fuel subsidies, and also phase in carbon taxes, tradable permits, internal carbon pricing to reduce climate change and all those other costs that are associated with fossil fuels. Now, both of these things either save you money, that's the case of phasing out subsidies, or they actually generate tax revenue, which is the case of taxes and to some extent permits. Those monies that are saved or generated could then be invested in much bigger investments to finance all sorts of public support for green innovation, public investment that we need for both mitigation and adaptation, and also income payments to vulnerable households. Now, we also heard in the last section the extent to which right now we are seeing that the disproportionate burden of climate change is falling on the vulnerable populations, many of which are ethnic or racial minorities in this country and across the world. And there are also households that are going to be affected by the transition away from fossil fuels, people who are working in the industry who are going to be displaced, or whole communities that depend on fossil fuels. So we do need to invest in either income payments, employment training, or additional public investments to support both vulnerable households, either who are displaced by the transition or those who are going to face the burden of all the damages from climate change, both today and into the future. Now, you may say, okay, that's an interesting proposition, this type of transition strategy, but it's not likely to happen for the United States as a whole. Well, it's starting to happen at the state level. So here's where there's a little bit of optimism. And I want to remind all of you that DC, for many of you probably are from California or from the West, your state capital is a lot closer than Washington, DC. And what we're seeing is that popular sentiment and also politics locally and at the state level is starting to have an impact. What we want to see is while we have gridlock at the federal and national level, we want to see much more of a bottom-up approach where U.S. states, which are often the ones in the front line of climate change, should phase in much more in the way of state carbon taxes and or tradable permits. So we can see a bottom-up approach of this strategy. Right now, already 13 U.S. states have some form of carbon pricing, including California, which has a cap and trade program for carbon. There are all sorts of entities out there. This is one of them, the C2ES, Market-Based State Policy Group, which can support states building a state-level local strategy for reducing greenhouse gas emissions that uses taxes and tradable permits. So there's a way to do this. Some states are doing it, and more can be done. The second thing is that all states, and I would recommend California doing this as well, is that look at what you're doing in terms of producer and other explicit fossil fuel subsidies at the state and local level, review that, phase them out, and use the money to invest elsewhere. Also work with state and local businesses to develop policies for climate risk mitigation and to instigate rules for internal carbon pricing. There are national bodies and there's international bodies that have provided guidelines on internal carbon pricing and climate risk mitigation. This would also make local businesses more resilient. And there's a demand for that from businesses. Around 20% of US companies already have been using some form of internal carbon pricing, and another 22% have suggested they are planning to adopt one in the near future. And then finally, what's the strategy statewide for recycling revenues? If you have carbon taxes, carbon permits that you auction off, and if you remove subsidies, the money can be invested on more mitigation and adaptation. California has funded over $28 billion in climate investments in the last 10 years from its cap and trade program, where it auctions off carbon permits. That sounds like a lot of money, and it is a good deal of money, but it could raise more through more carbon taxes and for getting rid of subsidies, and that could be done in a shorter period of time and would be geared towards, again, protecting the vulnerable and also helping those that are affected by fossil fuel transition. So it gets me back to the message. We will not make the transition away from from fossil fuels to low carbon sources fast enough to avert climate change unless, a catastrophic climate change, unless we do adopt a policy strategy at all levels that reduces the underpricing of fossil fuels through carbon pricing. Thanks very much.
It's really great to be here with everybody. You're probably steeped in some pretty intensive information over the course of the day that can really leave you feeling overwhelmed about the complexity of the problem. Really, I'm here to share the good news, that we really have everything that we need to heal the planet and reclaim our future. And I want to share that message with you all so that you can leave here today feeling empowered regardless of what particular issue you care about or what lever of change is really exciting and interesting to you. So let's dive in. You've probably heard this already today, but right now we're at about 1.3 degrees C average global temperature rise. Last year was the hottest year on record, and 2024 could very well beat that record. June this year was the hottest ever. By August, 13.4 million acres of rainforest in Brazil had burned. And just a few weeks ago, we witnessed the power and the enormity of hurricanes like Helene and Milton. And 2024 hasn't even wrapped yet. There's another hurricane on the way. Based on a series of UN reports, it's clear that the 1.5 degrees C in temperature rise has been determined as the upper limit when climatic changes could become unstoppable, triggering permanent drought and the loss of arable land. Given the impacts that we're seeing now, this quote from Christina Figueres, "Every tenth of a degree matters," really resonates. At One Earth, we've been dealing with the existential question, can we solve the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss? And if so, how? Until recently, there were no scientific models that showed how we could realistically have a good chance of achieving that 1.5 degrees C target using currently available solutions. So in 2017, we started the research efforts of One Earth, and since then, we've worked with over 50 leading scientists and experts across an array of disciplines working to answer different aspects of that question. This resulted in our first major scientific product, the One Earth Climate Model, which was led by Aerospace Center and University Technology Sydney. The good news is what the model ended up telling us. It was originally published in 2019 by Springer Nature, and it's a very dense scientific text called Achieving the Paris Climate Goals. It's 500 pages, so the answer to our question is certainly complicated, but I can give you the short answer. Yes, it is still possible to achieve this target with existing solutions. I am not saying it'll be easy. It's incredibly complex, but it is still possible. More recently, the second version of this model came out, and which provides 1.C aligned targets usable for the financial sector. That complex scientific text, along with other groundbreaking science like our Global Safety Net paper, can be simplified down into 3 pillars of action. We need to shift to 100% clean, renewable energy by 2050. We need to protect, connect, and restore 50% of the world's lands and oceans. And lastly, we need to transform our food and our fiber systems to regenerative agriculture. Over the past year, we've continued to refine the analysis of the science to communicate clearly what specific solutions the world needs to invest in, support, and implement now. To make this more actionable, we broke the models down into our solutions framework. All the color boxes that you see up at the top represent 76 distinct solution pathways across our 3 pillars in 12 broad categories. So up at the top, I call this the what. This is what we need to invest in, support, and scale. And at the bottom, you're seeing intersectional themes and levers of change. I call it the how. Intersectional themes are things like social justice and gender equity, which you can apply across solution sets. And levers of change are pretty obvious, but I think the thing to emphasize here is we need every single one of these levers of change. All of them are important. And this is a living, breathing document, so we will continue to add and refine this. So welcome everybody's input, especially on the levers of change and intersectional themes. So I'm going to take you down each of the 3 pillars, so let's take a closer look. The energy transition model was developed by engineers, so it takes a very pragmatic approach to breaking down solution pathways, dividing them into 4 main energy modalities: power, heat, transport, and efficiency. In total, that's 23 energy solution pathways. Every region, every city and state has a different makeup of renewable energy solutions that work for that area. And the transition to 100% renewable energy and mobility requires 100% access for all, with a cascade of benefits. Let's dive into my favorite, the second pillar, nature conservation. We asked ourselves at One Earth, what does biodiversity have to do with climate change? Are animals like wolves and tigers, toucans and tapirs actually critical for the survival of humanity? It turns out that they are. Thriving biodiversity is key to maintaining the health of our lands and ocean ecosystems that sequester and store carbon. By protecting habitat for biodiversity, we preserve our priceless carbon sinks, which are necessary to achieving the 1.5 degree C goal. One Earth tracks 24 distinct nature solution pathways: conservation of lands and oceans to ecosystem restoration and connectivity. Recent scientific literature shows that about 50% of the world's land is in natural or semi-natural condition. These lands act as our global carbon sponge, keeping the climate system from going haywire. We really cannot afford to lose any of it. We need a moratorium on deforestation by 2030, but that's not enough. In 2020, One Earth spearheaded a scientific effort with an array of conservation and biodiversity experts called the Global Safety Net. The effort found that we need to protect, connect, and restore 50% of the world's lands to ensure that biodiversity thrives and that we keep the critical carbon stores in the ground that are necessary to limit global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees C. Each region has a specific roadmap and goal depending on what is still intact and where there is potential for restoration and connectivity. I'm going to share a quick short video with you that goes over the science of the Global Safety Net and the key findings from it.
Nature is key to rebalancing our global climate system and ensuring a vibrant future for all. Ecosystems absorb carbon from the atmosphere and produce the essentials for life on our planet: fresh water, clean air, and healthy soil. Intact natural lands also help to prevent viral outbreaks like COVID-19. Tragically, in the past 50 years, we've lost half of our natural land, destroying 2/3 of all living creatures on Earth. We must reverse the damage, and we can, by creating the Global Safety Net, a network of land areas that are vital for nature and humanity. The Global Safety Net is the first comprehensive estimate of the total land area requiring protection to solve the twin crises of biodiversity loss and climate change. There are 6 main layers that make up the Global Safety Net. First, are areas already protected by governments, totaling 15% of the planet's land. Second, are species rarity sites. These are additional areas that need to be protected immediately before rare animals and plants are lost forever. Third are high biodiversity areas, groupings of plants and animals that are vital to maintaining our ecosystems. Fourth are large mammal landscapes, like the Pantanal wetlands of western Brazil, home to the world's largest jaguars. Fifth are areas with a large extent of intact wilderness, continuous forests, shrublands, and grasslands. Sixth are land areas that provide additional carbon absorption and storage, helping to stabilize our global climate system. The Global Safety Net also incorporates an analysis of potential wildlife corridors, areas of degraded land that can be restored to connect ecosystems back together, allowing nature to be more resilient as the Earth warms. Taken together, the layers of the Global Safety Net total approximately 50% of the world's land, offering a blueprint to restore our biosphere, helping to keep global temperature rise below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and providing the ecosystem services vital to our survival. Over 1/3 of these lands are communally held by Indigenous peoples, which demonstrates the importance of safeguarding territorial rights for these communities. You can explore the global safety net through a new web application, which displays how every country and region can contribute in different ways towards this common goal. Visit gsnapp.org to learn more about your region and how it can contribute towards a world in which nature and humanity coexist and thrive together.
Okay, thank you. So the Global Safety Net, the original piece of science, the original paper that came out in 2020. That paper, and we have additional pieces that we're building out and upgrading every year. But the science of the Global Safety Net actually helped influence a major global biodiversity agreement in 2020. And many of you might have heard about that, but that is around protecting 30% by 2030. To continue to empower decision makers and communities around the world with a clarity on how to best achieve these conservation goals, we continue to upgrade the science and make it accessible through the GSN mapping tool, which you can see here. And I'm excited to share that we are working on adding the map of the oceans now, a really clear prioritization of how much of the oceans, what the different layers are, et cetera. In fact, you can already go on the GSN mapping tool and view the preliminary mapping of the oceans. There's a lot of data here, so you just have to be patient with really exploring it on this sidebar and clicking which layers you want to see. We also are just kind of relaunching this app, so we'd really welcome folks utilizing it, giving us feedback. We have users in over 195 different countries. But there are a lot of people to reach. So getting feedback on the utility of this app is really great. Protecting that blueprint of nature identified through the Global Safety Net requires that we produce enough food and fiber for a growing global population on our existing agricultural footprint. And we need to grow our food and fiber in a way that is conducive to biodiversity, making our soil rich both in carbon storage capacity and supporting its ability to grow healthy, nutrient-rich foods. This will require scaling regenerative agriculture methods across our croplands and rangelands, implementing food waste solutions, and creating circular food and fiber systems. Our framework includes 29 distinct solution pathways to achieving the regenerative agriculture goals. It's important to note that 80% of the world's nutrition is produced by smallholder farmers, while industrial farms produce only 20% on an area twice the size. Supporting and scaling smallholder farmers with regenerative agriculture methodologies, often rooted in Indigenous knowledge and BIPOC traditions, is in fact a leading climate solution. At One Earth, we're making this knowledge accessible and inspiring and creating tools and innovative partnerships to drive action. One such collaboration is a partnership with Vibrant Data Labs, a social mission data science company. They recently created the Climate Finance Tracker tool, a publicly available tool that uses data science and AI to help everyone working on climate finance to easily see and explore who is funding whom. The current version tracks over $370 billion in funding to more than 10,000 US-based climate-relevant companies and nonprofits in the last 5.5 years. We partnered with VDL this year to combine our solutions framework with their climate finance tool, which will illuminate where climate finance is flowing according to what the planet needs us to do. Here are just a few slides showcasing the initial results. Here you can see an estimate of how much climate venture and philanthropy funding in the past 5 years went to the 3 main solution pillars: energy and mobility, nature conservation, and food and ag. Most of the growth is in climate-relevant funding has been private investments in the energy and mobility pillar. This momentum is amazing. But there's a glaring gap in funding for nature, with this pillar receiving less than 6% of the total funding and less than 1% of venture funding. We're aiming to launch the updated public tool and solutions investor report highlighting the gaps and opportunities by next fall, so we can help get the money moving more effectively and quickly. At One Earth, we believe that everyone has a role to play in this moment and that everyone deserves to feel a sense of agency. So we make the knowledge and the solutions accessible, inspiring, and actionable. Please check out our website to discover the solutions that speak to you, whether that's innovations in energy and technology, or rewilding, a process of restoring landscapes and bringing back species, supporting pollinators with native plants that they need, whether it's in your yards or even on your balconies, or scaling composting across our cities. You can also explore stories about the incredible people around the world who are putting these diverse solutions into action in their local communities. And please join us. We have the beginning of a community of people that are really dedicated to holding a North Star vision of what's possible in this moment. It requires transformation, it requires connectivity, and it requires care. So would really love for you all to join us. Thank you so much.
Hi, everyone. My name is Aradhna Tripati. My pronouns are she, they. And today I want to talk to you about how we can support the environmental imagination of people and how that can lead to systems change. I want to acknowledge the land and stewardship of the Native communities of Tavanga, this region, the LA Basin, and other areas. I think often about our relationships to place and to people, both historic and present day, and what this means for land stewardship and for climate action. My own family history is one with my parents emigrating from the Fiji Islands to the United States, with ancestry from India due to the colonial history of both places. As a result, I'm a settler in California, and here there have been 3 waves of colonialism that have affected landscapes and communities. I live and work on Tongva land, and UCLA is a land-grant university, which means that there are many complex relationships to place associated with where I work. Now, this whole series of relationships leads me to ask a series of questions that guide the work that we do about our climate futures. How do we honor the traditional and present stewards of a region, and what does that mean for addressing the climate crises? Who gets to dream when it comes to imagining our climate futures and whether these are resilient or not? Who gets to see whether or not those dreams are made a reality? Who gets to shape climate futures from research to practice? Who shapes the climate movement? Who shapes policy? So with this, the work we do with the Center for Diverse Leadership in Science, it centers on the visions and ecologies of people from communities that have historically and at present faced injustice. And we heard about some of these communities and their importance for stewardship in the last talk. Now, in our work, we equip and directly support movement partners and also the next generation of movement leaders while we collaborate on projects. What we've heard from our partners who envision resilient climate futures is the importance of this transition from what is currently the dominant system to a new emergent system, one where collaboration is grounded in healthy relationships with land, with people, with the environment. And we need to see that resources are being steered in ways that support community priorities, that support the health of communities, and bring resources together in ways that are respectful of cultures and of community sovereignty, in ways that build long-term capacity and power in communities with deep commitment and advocacy from partners. And for that reason, our work is systems change. Now, with the work that we do, we facilitate imagination, we nurture the dreams and actions of potential organizers using this whole series of interventions that I show here, from financial support to skills training, team-based collaboration, work on storytelling, outreach, engagement, work with artists, teachers, social workers, as well as scientists. And we support diverse role models and network leadership, people interacting to provide mentoring to each other, and all really deeply rooted in advancing justice, equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts in society. And by doing this, what we are in fact practicing is the centering of people, repair, and the thriving of environment with an emergent system where knowledges are shared, co-created, and used by and for the benefit and well-being of all communities. Now, the workshops and programming structure that we have mean that people are participating in a number of non-traditional training opportunities, the types of things that can really seed cultural awareness and cultural transformation, from looking at the intersections of American Indian studies and STEM to being candid about the obstacles that people face from communities of color, to looking at the ways that science and art can really serve to engage and amplify each other, just as actually this day of events is doing. Taking a critical lens when looking at urban ecologies, to looking at the healing of intergenerational trauma, because in fact, that is what the climate crisis is the result of, many generations of traumatic engagement with the environment, including with communities. Now, all of this work is done in ways where we reflect and we share, and we focus on storytelling that is community-centered. Now, what this drives then, people being empowered and collaborating on projects. And the folks that we're working with are artists, ecologists, policymakers, people who are doing this in the present, and people who will be at the front lines of leadership in the generations ahead. So we view really the work as supporting and empowering current and future movement leaders. We do this through an ecosystem of fellowship programs, community fellows, early career fellows, and faculty fellows. I joke we're from K through Gray. And I want to tell you about some of the projects we collaborate on and just how they've impacted us here in Los Angeles and here in the state of California. Now, I show here a mother and daughter from Southeast LA, Monique Uriarte and Naili Cobo. How many of you have heard of either of them? Great, a few people here have. And I'm sure those of you who have been incredibly inspired. I'm so glad that many of you haven't, because there's a chance here to uplift their work. They're movement leaders who are part of Esperanza Community Housing, an affordable housing project not so far from where we are. Monique is part of Esperanza's first cohort of promotores, community health promoters. Esperanza has now trained 700 of them. Their leadership is one that led to the founding of an organization called People Not Pozos, People Not Oil Wells. Their dream was one that was rooted from the injustices that they faced. Naili and Monique lived across the street from an oil well. Los Angeles is actually the largest urban oil field in the country. Now, this is something that impacts all of our health. We all live in Los Angeles, right? So this is something that, unbeknownst to many of us, in fact, is taking a toll on us and on our families and friends each and every day. Now, 6 years ago, they were in the thick of working on their campaign. Naili at that stage was 17 years old. They had lived across from this oil well since she was 9 years old. We connected, and I learned of what they'd imagined in conversation and what they needed. What they wanted to see was that members of their community would be connected with resources and have the confidence so that they could believe in themselves, so that they could further this work. They wanted fellowships for youth and adults, mentorship so that their communities could access science, education, and resources for storytelling. They needed that to achieve their goals. They also wanted to see in the community land and infrastructure local to them, so more people from the community could benefit from resources instead of having them outside of the community. Now, they wanted to learn to make GIS maps, maps that could show what levels of different air pollutants were associated with oil and gas drilling and their health. And they wanted opportunities and platforms to share stories for impact and access to networks. So they became fellows of the center. They steered the resources we have, and they progressed their vision. GIS for Community Health, their program that we co-produced, has now supported 2 cohorts of youth and promotores from East LA, working with college students from around Southern California, with 3 months of programming at a time, all groups inspiring each other. Story maps, platforms, art, presentations to the national academies, the World Climate Research Program, One Health. And now, there is in fact a city and county-wide ban on oil drilling in residential neighborhoods. There's a medical buffer zone that's been passed, And this was then passed in the entire state of California on the backs of their efforts. That is climate action. So that, to me, is what environmental imagination means and the way that it can impact us. The Better Watts Initiative, participatory environmental justice in the community in South LA. Now, this started off with decades and decades of environmental activism, social justice activism by community leaders in Watts. We learned of this through students from the community, worked with them in listening sessions, developed frameworks for ethical partnership, which was then published by community authors in collaboration, literature reviews about the impacts of lead in the community. Community of Watts is at the intersection of 3 freeways. It's between them. The air pollution levels are absolutely extraordinary, and because of the history of leaded gasoline, much of that lead has been deposited in the community. There's other issues with lead in paint and lead in other forms in the community. Now, through the measurement of lead and advocacy, an art science exhibition in the community, community garden support, participatory curriculum for high school students, and so much more. There's just recently been a series of reports that the state EPA and national EPA have paid attention to, and our mayor has stepped in and to ensure that the 10% of affordable housing where lead was found, that is eradicated. Now, I also want to highlight the leadership that's present in our Indigenous communities locally, and as an example of what we see across the world. Now, what's shown here in the upper right is probably not what most of you envision, what I envisioned growing up in LA, as water in LA. But this is a sacred spring site called Curravunga Springs that's in West LA. It's the one site that the Gabrielino Tongva have the rights to steward in Los Angeles. And look at this. It's an absolutely extraordinary place. Now, through a project on Indigenous waters of California, according to community priorities, Tongva elders have been steering the measurement and interpretation of chemical data for this sacred spring. That data was then used by them as the basis for a renewal of land management and an agreement by local policymakers to liberate another spring. Now, Los Angeles only gets about 10% of its water from local groundwater. We take most of it from other places. Just imagine if this type of stewardship was the norm. Los Angeles has hundreds of springs like this, but they're not stewarded. Now, fellows are also engaging in native plant restoration, stewardship. We have a project with the Broad Museum on an upcoming exhibition inspired by Joseph Bowie's 7,000 Oaks, social forest, that will represent another example of what it means to have Tongva stewardship. Now, another work along the California coast, this is further north in the area of Watsonville and Santa Cruz. We're supporting a tribal stewards network with tribe-to-tribe relationship building, cultural relearning, and ecological stewardship. This is a model for sustainable partnership and equitable collaboration right here close to home. And I just want to highlight that this has led to a dam removal and the development of Mutsun scholars and Mutsun steward researchers, people who had never imagined themselves in this space, but that are now actively building power in tribal communities in ways that impact carbon emissions, that impact regenerative agriculture, and that impact the things that we just heard about. Now, key for this work is being deeply rooted in cultural institutions, art, storytelling. And so I want to highlight the importance of artists and storytellers, community leaders, spirituality, whatever this looks like to you. This is actually a way of connecting with your own values and connecting with others with respect to our relationships, to ourselves, to the environment, and to climate action. And so we have a number of different projects we've been developing. I realize we're coming up to time. So I just want to highlight, though, the importance of being grounded in arts and storytelling. And that when we do this, the potential for connecting environmental imagination, climate action with the inspiration of policymakers can result in a number of downstream policy impacts, from that medical buffer zone that I mentioned to a whole series of incredibly exciting policy outcomes that are evidence-based decision-making with very broad swathes of impacts. So our challenge right now is that all of us need to find ways to participate in engaging and inspiring each other so that we can nourish and grow the influence of this type of work. We need to strengthen an emergent system, one that interrupts patterns of oppressive and destructive behaviors. And I think that starting off with our own relationships to place here in Los Angeles and to each other, and challenging places that we work, places that are institutions in the community like this one, like MOCA, to ask, what are we doing to, in fact, strengthen this network and to enhance collective impacts in meaningful ways is key. Now, I show here what is one of the most photographed works in the world, infinity mirror rooms. Here in Los Angeles, with the Olympics coming up, the whole world will be staring at us. There's an opportunity for really looking at what we do over the next couple of years and what we call on each other to do in ways that could inspire the rest of the world, or in ways that could show these are things that need to be done better. But we are a mega city that is diverse and has so much potential. And so with that, thank you. I hope I've shared with you what's special that we've been enabled to do being in community. And so despite the barriers, the histories, the scale of challenges from broken relationships with land and marginalized, harmed communities that shape all of our histories, what you've seen is something that gives me hope for what's emerging from stewardship, from storytelling, and from the empowerment of each other in the next generation. Thank you.
Thanks for inviting me to come. It's really good to be here. I'm Peter Kalmus. I'm a climate scientist. I work at NASA's Jet Propulsion Laboratory. I am speaking on my own behalf. I've got so many thoughts, and I've been getting so many thoughts by watching and listening to the previous speakers. It's hard to know where to start and what to say in such a short amount of time. I've been arrested a few times for climate disobedience. It's been easily the most impactful thing that I've been able to do so far, because we're trying to build a movement here, and there's a million ways to do that. But like when I go to climate marches in New York City, for example, I think it's the civil disobedience that kind of, when people come up to me and say that they're now climate activists too, that's what they kind of cite as what inspired them to do that the most. And I think what we really need here is numbers, huge numbers of people getting involved. I think right now there's a teeny tiny number of people, and what we have is a problem of power. So a lot of the solutions that have been kind of put forth, like Ed's idea of a price on carbon, I think that's a great idea. I've thought about that a lot, but we're still far away from having policymakers actually start to implement that. And I think the problem is that the public still does not have a clear grasp of two things: cause and urgency. All right, so that's going to be one of the themes of my talk today. And if you take one thing away today, it's that the fossil fuel industry is the cause of irreversible global overheating. And I think that's what we should start to call this instead of climate change. That's what we have. It's a planet that is in the process of overheating, and it's effectively irreversible. It's going to take a long, long time for the various impacts that we've been talking about today to start to go back down. Biodiversity loss has a recovery timescale of 10 million years. That's the longest timescale. But even extreme heat, if we're very quick at addressing this overheating emergency, it's still going to take generations for the heat to start to come back down to, let alone things like sea level rise and changing ocean circulations, potential loss of the Amazon rainforest, which some tropical forest scientists think may already be past its tipping point. So, okay, gonna get started with these slides. Again, like I said, it's hard to know where to start. There is a lot of cause for optimism, but I think we should be really careful about maybe false types of hope or false types of optimism. I get asked by reporters all the time about mental health crisis among young people who are, obviously being increasingly concerned, anxious, grief-stricken by irreversible global overheating. It's quite clear to me that, to me personally, I feel completely let down by people in power, the presidents, the prime ministers, the world leaders, the corporate leaders, the religious leaders. If I was a young person now, if I was a teen or if I was in my 20s, I would feel 10 times probably as betrayed by them. And the only way that we can have real hope is for there to be real, meaningful action. I'm going to first tell you a few false solutions just because it's kind of a pet peeve of mine, and then get onto kind of like a theory of change and where I think we need to intervene to start to get some of this, the sort of, in a way, kind of fairly obvious solutions that we need, right? Like making coal, oil, and gas more expensive. It's a great idea. Expanding solar and batteries and wind, it's a great idea. It's not like these aren't new ideas. It's just very hard to do them when we still have presidential debates where one candidate says it's a hoax and like produces word salad, and the other candidate says climate change is real, let's do more fracking, right? When the cause is oil, coal, and gas, right? 80% of irreversible global heating is from fossil fuels. Most of the rest of that is from industrial animal agriculture, especially cows. But this one kind of takes the cake in some ways. This graphic is from a frickin' New York Times article. The Times has, and the media in general, have really fallen flat on their face in terms of how they report and talk about and then ultimately help us think about irreversible global heating. This is the idea of, a sunshade. They talked about a startup in this article in the New York Times, which came out like a year or two ago. These guys, these startups, they're looking for $10 to $20 million to put a 100 square foot prototype of a sunshade in space. 100 square feet, 10 feet by 10 feet. So that much by that much, pretty much. You would need more than 270 billion of those to have enough sunshade to have a chance of reducing the planetary heat by 1.5 degrees Celsius, which Justin had been talking about earlier. It's like, this is what, we can't stop, commercial aviation and this kind of like overconsumption that Ed talked about. This seems easier to some people than, Elon Musk talking about going to Mars, right? It's in the same category as this, than just like taking care of each other and getting rid of billionaires, taxing them out of existence, redistributing that wealth globally, not just in the United States. One thing that popped in my mind when I was listening to these talks is it's extractive colonial capitalism, stupid. It's also corporations, right? And the billionaire class and the CEOs, it's just like, they're just throttling everything. Like we can't even have healthcare, let alone stop climate change when these corporations control everything, control the media, control politicians with basically legalized bribes, control how we think, right, through advertisement and kind of these narratives that we're swimming in, right? So this one's ridiculous. This one's ridiculous too. This is the world's largest direct carbon capture facility in Iceland. It's capable, if you believe the startup that is doing it, and I don't think they're very transparent about how much it costs and how well it works. If you believe them, this takes 3 seconds worth of humanity's emissions out of the atmosphere every year, which is about 40 Americans worth of emissions. So you need like 10 million of these just to break even, right, with like carbon dioxide from burning fossil fuels. I don't even know how many of these it would take just to offset Bill Gates's private jet, let alone the rest of his emissions, but I think it would be roughly 200 of these just to offset Bill Gates. So when people talk about carbon capture, what they're saying is, like when older generations talk about this, right, like the people in charge right now, the fossil fuel executives, et cetera, what they're saying is screw young people, because we're going to keep emitting, and then you're going to figure this crap out, right? And you're going to spend like basically all of your attention, all of your money doing this, pulling our carbon. You young people are going to pull our carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere when you're getting hit by worsening hurricanes and your crops are failing and your forests are burning down and your cities are all flooding. Like, you'll figure it out, right? It's just so deeply unethical. I just find it strange that I even have to say these things out loud. Like, there's still very powerful people and New York Times articles like pushing this stuff, and it's just patently stupid, right? And unethical. This is the one false solution that is actually maybe a little bit useful. This is stratospheric aerosol geoengineering. Basically, you put pollution high up in the atmosphere by flying planes up there. It does have the potential to reflect sunlight and make the Earth cool, but it's also an absolutely terrible idea for a bunch of reasons. One is that it's going to, sorry, yeah, I do have good ideas at the end of this that we should do, things that we should do, but I just get so mad by this stuff, so angry. And this is setting up the second part of my talk really well, I just realized. Because I'll the thing that we need, the solution I'm going to propose is a very systemic, coherent, well-funded education campaign for the public so they can understand cause and they can understand urgency. So I'll tell you, as a climate scientist, I feel so ignored, unlistened to. When Biden was running, when he was during the primaries, he was talking about like we listen to the scientists, and then like gets into office and expands oil and gas like there's no tomorrow, right? Like permits on public lands and public waters just as fast as the Trump administration. Fast tracking the Mountain Valley pipeline, which we don't even need. That's for fossil gas that's being exported, just so like rich people like Joe Manchin can get richer, right? So. Anyway, the problems with this stratospheric aerosol geoengineering, first, you're going to like affect precipitation in other countries. So one country does this, you're going to change landfall, change how other countries can grow food. But the two worst things, I think, one is this is going to be used as a narrative, a powerful narrative, to allow fossil fuels to continue being expanded for longer, entrenching us into this problem even more. And then if the airplanes doing this ever stop flying, even for a few weeks, you're going to get what's called termination shock. And suddenly a huge spike in temperatures, which is just going to be devastating to humans and to other life on Earth. So it's a very dystopian thing. So I wrote an op-ed about this a while back. The climate talks, the United Nations climate talks, the Conference of Parties, has been deeply overrun by the fossil fuel industry. And this wouldn't really be a problem if the fossil fuel industry was actually trying to help. But Amy Westerveld and others, she's a climate reporter, have made it very clear and documented the fact that over about the last 50 years, the fossil fuel industry, oil, coal, and gas, has systemically spread disinformation to confuse the public, to make it so that I'm not heard as a climate scientist, right? So that there's confusion and to delay things and to bribe politicians. So they are not good actors. I saw John Kerry at Climate Week. I saw John Kerry at the New York Climate Week thing a few weeks ago, and I asked him about that, about like the fossil fuel industry in the climate talks, and he got super defensive. I was very shocked. He was like, Like, they're not the problem. We've gotten more out of them this last time than we ever have before. I'm not sure exactly what that means. But he seemed really mad that I would say maybe we shouldn't let the oil, coal, and gas industry control the climate talks. But the reason for this is because, like, in 2021, these people, Michael Wirth, Darren Woods, Gretchen Watkin, and David Lawler, and also another person who's the president of the American Petroleum Institute, went in front of Congress and they lied about the disinformation campaign that they've been doing. And they, when directly asked, will you stop funding disinformation, they refused to say yes. They instead did the whole word salad thing where they don't say yes or no, but they're just laughing all the way to the bank and thinking to themselves, of course we're gonna keep funding disinformation because that's how we get super rich and block climate action. So the solution is ending the fossil fuel industry, but how do we do that when they're this powerful, right? Again, people need to know cause and urgency. So cause is on the left, it's those guys. And if they had been good actors, if they hadn't been spreading disinformation, and again, this is well documented, they put like ads in magazines in the 70s and 80s, literally saying there is no climate change. The planet's not overheating, when they knew damn well that it was. Oops. And then urgency on the right, that's an image of a home in Asheville from a few weeks ago. Even with Hurricane Helene, the New York Times reporting of this, and I'm picking on the New York Times because they're sort of in some ways, kind of the best major media outlet. I think a lot of the other ones are doing even worse. But they're reporting about Hurricane Helene. They did not, there's a couple of things that are really critical to the story of irreversible global heating that almost never, ever get reported in the media, okay? One of those is that this hurricane, for example, let's take Hurricane Helene as just an example. This was caused by the fossil fuel industry, right? And I don't just say fossil fuels, I say fossil fuel industry because of the fact they've been purposely, systemically lying and spreading disinformation for so long, and they recently promised to keep doing it, right? If the fossil fuel industry was genuinely part of the solution, I'd say, or they were good actors, I would say fossil fuels is the cause, but it's actually the fossil fuel industry. So articles don't ever say that. And then the other thing the articles almost never say is that this will get worse and worse and worse until we end fossil fuels. It just will. I mean, that's basic physics. You hear the phrase "a new normal" like repeated a lot. It's not a new normal; it's a trend line. So it's a diagonal line going up, right? Ice is a diagonal line going down. Sea level rise going up. Global temperature is going up. Sea surface temperature going up. It goes up so long as we keep burning fossil fuels. That's it. So I think we need organized and funded sort of PR initiative that basically allows climate scientists to be as kind of a slick of an information system as the fossil fuel industry has been, but with the correct information. Climate scientists, we're scientists. We're not like slick kind of PR people, and we've been so far just working individually as best we can through social media, doing stuff like this to get the message out to the public, but it's not enough. It's not fast enough. If I were, if we're lucky enough to get a Democratic administration in a couple of weeks, I hope that they put a little bit of money into educating the public about climate change. I don't have high hopes though, based on the last few Democratic administrations. Get these guys, get the billionaire class, the CEO class that's been actively blocking action out of power. And then, like I said at the beginning, solutions abound. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. And this will be our last conversation today. You can text questions to the phone number there. That was exceptional. Thank you.
Just want to check.
As we begin this panel, is that I want to start with some thanks. It's often good to thank the people who bring us here today. First, I want to thank your commitment to your work.
They just lost power. We just got that note, so just hang tight 1 second.
So we're going to do the old-fashioned method, which is amplification.
The mics might still.
We want to thank the Manatee Fund and the MOCA Environmental Council. I want to again thank Rebecca Lowery, who brought Josh's show to fruition as the curator of the exhibition. Kelsey Shell, who has been an exceptional steward of everything environmental sustainability at MOCA and who worked gracefully with Elisa, are we good? With Elisa on the aspects of the organization today. And I don't see Elisa's here, but just great work. I'd like to again thank David Johnson, who's in the back, who's my co-founder and co-chair at the Environmental Council. Who's been a major supporter from everything from funding to thought partner to social strategies to truly strong advocate for environmental justice education in the Los Angeles greater area. Thank you, David. You are a hero, time and time again. Lisa, we look to you for stewardship in terms of education and public connection, and thank you for your work. And Johanna, without you and your presence, we wouldn't be able to do this work. This is, just for all who are present, this is the first time anything like this has happened at an American art institution at this scale. And I just saw today the testimony as to this exceptional fabric of commitment, intelligence, unique stories, narratives, and personal trust and faith that if we act, things will get better. So it gave me exceptional pause to say, okay, there were nights researching all of your bios, your stories to bring you here today, and I'm glad those nights were spent that way. I lastly would like to see if Andrea Bowers is still here. Okay, she was here for a while. She will come in and be a leader in the Environmental Council. She's a great artist, internationally recognized, luckily living in Los Angeles, so we're grateful for her moving on as co-chair of the council. With that, to begin the strategies and solutions section, I wanted to start with creativity. And this series, this symposium is based around thoughts, parallel thoughts, tangential thoughts to Josh's exhibition. To move into the future and to find ways forward, we're gonna need to be creative, which means we're gonna need to think of ways of being that we are not already. And I think all four of you presented a need, and you presented decisive action of what will not work, and you presented proposals to what will work. And so much of what artists do is you imagine something, but you're also bringing it into physical fruition, into action, into practice. So I'd like to begin with creativity. Josh, would you like to start?
Sure. I'm going to circle back to some of the other things that I've been speaking about throughout the day, which is about communication. And I think the last round of speakers have done a great job in terms of helping understand how we might be able to communicate about these issues, especially Peter Kalmus's great graphics at the end, which really cut to the chase. I mean, I think this, sometimes it's these little anecdotes that stick with you, and I think the one that will stick with me is the number of carbon capture facilities that would be necessary to offset Bill Gates's private travel on his private jet. And it's funny, but it's real. Why should Bill Gates be so responsible for for our future?
Yeah, I've been thinking about him recently too, because he's got some new show on Netflix, and they wanted me to be part of it. And I'm like, well, here's what I'm gonna say about Bill Gates, and then they didn't actually have me on. It's that kind of documentary. So
there's a lot of this. There's a lot of this around. But I think I really do people often ask me because they're like, if depending on how much of the video they watch upstairs or like how deeply they get into the work, they're like, oh, you're telling us things that we already know, you know, like what is there, you know, like, yes, the climate change is happening, but what are we supposed to do about it? And I mean, there is a discussion about that in the videos up there, but beyond that, you know, I think like one of the answers is really about taxes. Like I keep coming back to taxes and to policies and what do taxes mean? And I think my understanding of taxes has changed radically in the last year because I've come to understand inflation in a different way. And you know, all of these things inevitably connect to the climate crisis because again, taxes are how we generate the money that we can use to do the adaptation and mitigation and the other activities that are going to be necessary to grapple with this legacy and this present that we have been given. And I feel like I should share this with you because it took me a while to understand like what has just happened to us during COVID. A great amount of money was printed. Like there were stimulus payments that we were given, like billions of dollars, hundreds of billions of dollars were generated out of thin air and given to all of us while we were trapped in our houses or working as essential workers, which was then captured by the billionaire class. It all went to Amazon, to landlords, to, you know, not just Jeff Bezos, Elon Musk, all of them, they all got stupendously richer. And, you know, it's fine to generate the stimulus, it was very helpful, but at the end of all of this, the issue is that that money was never taken out of the financial system. So it remains here. It remains captured by these same rich people, Bill Gates on his plane flitting around the world. And the problem with this is that it has made all of the money worth less. They have more of it, and what we have in our savings is worth less. And that's actually what inflation is. That's what the current round of inflation is. That's why everything costs more. It's because that money that was put into the system in an emergency was not taken back out on the other side. And I think thinking about climate, it is important to look at it in the context of, you know, the larger global economic system and everything that's going on, because it's not separate, it's all one thing. So I think that thinking about policy and connecting it to something as basic as taxes is really important.
I think that brings us to our first question. What are thoughts on a global minimum tax? Global minimum. Maybe Ed, you want to begin with tax?
Well, let me just get back to what Josh said, which is quite insightful. Basically, we have created for decades, hundreds of years, centuries, an economy that basically is subsidized by nature. And what I mean by that is that our economy is created so it's separate from nature, so we're expecting all the resources that we use from nature to be as cheap as possible, and then all the pollution that we dump back in nature we don't pay for. So we do this over a time period and scale where we're growing our economy. And finally, nature isn't as unlimited as it used to be. We're reaching the end of the planetary limits for all this extracting of resources for as cheap as possible and dumping waste in as cheap as possible. What's the result? 4 global environmental risks: climate change, land use loss and biodiversity destruction, deteriorations of oceans and coasts, freshwater scarcity. All these 4 problems, as I write about in my book, Economics for a Fragile Planet, are all related to this underpricing, subsidizing of nature in our economy, essentially subsidizing our economy by exploiting nature. And we do this in 2 ways. One is that it's not just that we give a zero value or a little value to nature, the things it does for us, the good things, like protect our water systems, protect our coasts from storms, providing fresh water for us, and so on and so on. We pay very little for those things, if next to nothing, but we actually heavily subsidize activities that destroy nature and adding to the worst aspects of it. So getting back to Josh's point, we've reached a point where we expect to be subsidized all the time. We expect to have handouts. So we're subsidizing all these environmentally damaging activities. And at the same time, if we want to do anything to protect nature, we have to pay out of our pockets and subsidize that investment. And what that means is that we can't keep up with the environmentally harmful subsidies by having environmentally motivated subsidies. And so then when we say, okay, well, maybe a different way of thinking about this is that let's pay for the costs that we know we're already facing, from climate damages, from people dying from air pollution or getting sick from that. And there's a bird in this room. That's Peter. Yeah. And for the birds in nature, we want to protect them too, right? But we're not willing to pay for that. And we see those taxes as being a bad thing. But we're already suffering the cost. The money I showed to you was $2,000 per person in the United States, just for what we did in 2020. Now it's probably $3 or $4. But if you were somebody who actually was impacted directly by climate change, it's even worse. The numbers are worse. You lose your house, you lose your living, you have to migrate to somewhere else, and so forth.
Thank you, Ed. Did you want to answer?
Yeah, there were 2 points that I want to make. I completely agree with what you said, but I want to highlight, I was a co-author in the National Climate Assessment on the climate change impacts, and as part of my research on that, I came across the statistic that every 3 weeks in the US, there is a $1 billion climate disaster. Every 3 weeks. At a given time, in the summer, more than a third of the country might be dealing with extreme heat, which is the leading cause of death in terms of climate-related risk, and one of the leading causes of death overall. So we are paying an enormous price already. And I want to highlight that the fossil fuel industry that is causing this is not bearing the cost. So yes, I agree that the importance of taxes, but let's talk very clearly about the losses that we are all already seeing and paying for. This has impacted our health. I'm sure a number of people here have things like asthma. They may have issues like Nayeli and her mom both have asthma. Nayeli developed cancer at the age of 17. A number of the kids in the neighborhood have developed different forms of cancer. It's a hot spot right here in LA. I've just talked to you about the financial costs that we're incurring. You look at Hurricane Helene that just happened as one example, right? And then the hurricane that was just before that. So we are continuing to bear the costs of this, whereas that could be going to other things in our society, and it's not. So there are a whole series of bills that are being considered at the state level and even being considered at the national level that would lead to the fossil fuel industry paying for the cost of climate damage. They need to pay their fair share. So what this specifically looks at, in California, there's Senate Bill 1497. I was one of the scientists who, provided professional testimony for this. And I want to highlight what it does is just look at the last 20 years of carbon emissions from the fossil fuel industry. Self-reported data. We already know how much Exxon, Chevron, et cetera, each of them have emitted. And they then will pay proportionally for their share of climate damages. Because right now, it's all the taxpayers that are the ones that are 100% fielding those costs. So those bills are under consideration in California, Vermont, Massachusetts, New York, and at the federal level.
I so appreciate Ed and Aradhna, you pointing this out in terms of this shared responsibility, but also from the profit sourcing. A question came forward, recent argument made in Brett Christopher's book, The Price is Wrong. The global economy is moving too slowly towards sustainability because the return on green investment is too low. Unfortunately, carbon pricing, which is significant, even ending fossil fuel subsidies, won't catalyze green capitalism to move fast enough to what we need by 2030. We cannot expect markets and the private sector to solve the climate crisis while the profits that are their lifeblood remain unappetizing. But there is an alternative to providing surrogate green profits through subsidies to take energy out of private sector's hands. What are the speaker's opinions of a wholesale transition to public power, ownership of energy systems, including a fossil fuel infrastructure by the state, allowing for managed decarbonization and energy transition?
So we're talking about nationalization of the,
think we
yeah. Yeah, I think it's a great idea. I've thought about that a little bit. It's not quite clear how to, so there's, again, like I said in my talk, there's a lot of stuff that we should do. There's so many tragedies within tragedies here, but one of them is that, like, as this overheating crisis ramps up, like, one way that it could go is those CEOs I showed and people like them get richer and richer as, like, supply gets constricted, and you know, working class people, middle class people, oppressed people they can't pay for energy, they can't pay for gas, they're not able to buy electric cars, so they're getting squeezed, right? They're deeply opposed. They would then become deeply opposed to things like a carbon tax, right? Which is why I kind of believe that it's probably really dangerous if you have a carbon tax to keep some of that money to do things like green investment. Probably it should be a climate income, and it should all go back to the people. Otherwise, you get like the yellow jackets in France, and then the working class, then you get more people going over to the Republicans, et cetera. So it's a very hard problem, but anyway, I'll let you guys. We need the public to know how urgent this is, and we need them to know that it's caused by the fossil fuel industry. But yeah, and this is so deep, right? Because, you know, the previous panel was talking about the role of capitalism and how to reimagine a completely new way to self-organize as a society based on things like enoughness instead of like this voracious appetite to become the first trillionaire, right? Enoughness and mutual aid, and kind of like, you know, putting others before self and making sure others have enough, and treating other species, trees and other beings, as basically our equals, right? We have this like very, thank you, there's a very kind of species, this like human-centric thing that we have, which is part of the problem. Like it's incredibly arrogant of us.
Love to pass that on to Justin.
I guess I just wanted to jump in here to say that really at the center of this problem is this, that we're in a moment in our society where, in our civilization, where we're deeply disconnected from nature. So all of this conversation is so rich and so important. But I actually have every faith that there are creative, smart strategies and solutions to get us out of here, but not unless we literally put nature and equity at the center of the proposition. And when you have so much of civilization completely disconnected from an understanding of how life systems on our planet are supporting and making life possible here, that we are in fact nature, and that we cannot exist without intact, healthy, vibrant ecosystems. That's at the center of the problem. And so one of the things that gives me kind of a lot of hope is that we have brilliant, creative, artistic people across many different sectors that need to completely transform. But again, they have to change what they put at the center of the proposition. And that includes our economic system. I mean, our economic system was never built in any way to value nature, as you said. And so it's problematic from the start. So I know it sounds overwhelming to think about mass transformation, but the truth is there's so many solutions at the core that we already have evidence of showing us the way forward. And many of them kind of honor indigenous, indigenous traditions, local communities whose cultures have a very direct tie and connection to the land. To me, it's, if you only stick in the conversation around policy and the details there, you're missing the opportunity to be more creative and transformative in how we're going to approach this problem.
So I just want to add a couple of things that's important. You know, it's really interesting is that we're all sometimes, even the most enlightened people like Peter are a victim of false information. You know, the Yellow Jacket protests in France is often heralded as the reason why we shouldn't do a carbon tax. Yet there's example after example after example where a carbon tax has been used and has been rebated back either as income dividends back to households, or it's been going into social investments or into funding innovation where it is working. And yet, I think this gets back to what was talked about. Josh mentioned it in the last panel, which is that, you know, where do this misinformation comes from? It's like your personal carbon footprint. I'm not saying that, you know, but there's a lot of vested interests behind saying let's not do something about changing our market system by imposing taxes, getting rid of subsidies. That's one thing. Second thing, don't want to lose the minimum tax thing because that's important, is that earlier on in 2015, I published a book called Nature and Wealth, where I explained how our problem of nature and not dealing with scarcity, just like Justin said, in our economy, and not recognizing ecological scarcity and valuing it, is connected to our wealth inequality. And it's all tied up together. This is why we keep coming back to it. And one of the things we refuse to think about as a possible option, but is starting to happen more at the local and in some countries, such as Finland, is to think about a minimum dividend payment, a minimum payment to households, particularly poor households, a minimum income payment. And it's not a minimum tax, but it's to say everybody gets a level of income, and then, you know, the poorer you are, of course, the more you get, and maybe some households get nothing. But if we have a guaranteed income scheme to prevent poverty, that can actually alleviate some of the problems. A way to fund that is to tax the bad things in society.
So that's exactly what I was saying and why I called it a climate income. I'm not against carbon pricing. I think it's very hard to see how we get there at the federal level when we can't even talk about climate change in a freaking presidential debate. But all I think is that we have to be very careful about policies that would make survival energy and food, et cetera, more expensive for the working class and for the oppressed. So if you put a tax on gas, for example, then that would be a very unpopular policy. But if you have a carbon price and you give it back as a climate income, that, you know, I'm not opposed to that.
And Aradhna, then I have a question for Peter. Go for it.
I really appreciate that the discussion has been touching on these issues of what does it look like to center justice in this transition that needs to occur. And I really want to also highlight the importance of centering people from frontline communities in those discussions and in taking decisions about what is to happen. In fact, I think that when we look at, you know, whether energy companies should be nationalized, whether we should see the rise of, you know, community-based cooperatives, what in fact our future energy system should look like. Again, we need to be looking at things from at a local level and connecting with local communities on this. And I would also highlight that there's often this disconnect between what we think, you know, a set of policies should actually look like and what the enforcement of them looks like and what the impact is in people on the ground. I just came from a conference in Mexico City where there were three women who were land defenders from different parts of the country that we were listening to, and it reminded me of just what types of struggles are occurring also right here at home, right? And so with that, the importance of centering justice and not just talking about or for communities, but in fact bringing community members to the table, building tables around them. So let's think about what that looks like when it comes to democratic engagement, when it comes to decision-making with the future of the climate movement, right? In fact, we see that there is leadership time and time again in communities, and that this is occurring right now, but those voices aren't always being listened to, right? And there are issues with the justice, the economics of it that you were, you know, bringing up that I think are also important to foreground. Because I love going to festivals. One of the festivals I went to is one called the Byline Festival, focused on journalism and also on models of democratic engagement when some of the mainstream models we're utilizing are failing us. And they talked about the importance of community assemblies, climate assemblies, citizens' assemblies, the unfortunate term that sometimes is used. I truly believe that that is actually a model for setting out policy when it comes to climate at the local level, and then providing, in fact, information to policymakers at the to formal policymakers at the local to state to national and international levels about what we want to see happen.
Thank you. Thank you for that. As part of our democratic commitment to everyone who's here today spending their Sunday, I want to get every question out. So we're going to make pithy answers because I'm getting more questions than minutes. Peter, can you speak a little bit more about the role of civil disobedience in creating change? And the theme today has been that the problem is somewhat of a class struggle. You say you want a revolution. Is that what it's going to take?
Yeah, I think so, yeah, at some level. I'd love to see the climate movement really kind of merge with the labor movement. That hasn't happened yet. I think that's like a fertile ground for the future. Civil disobedience is a communication technology, essentially. People put up barriers to the emotions, the anxiety and the grief, like when you kind of realize that the way you've always imagined humans do things and the way we do things in all of these systems and the comforts that we have, like all of the radical transformation, it's scary, right? So we have all kinds of, it's like layers of onion in our brains kind of protecting us from that, opening up to that realization that basically everything needs to change. And I think the civil disobedience is a way to kind of like go right to the core of that onion really fast and like kind of like exhibit this, to bring the facts, right? The things that we know from the science into alignment with emotional presentation, that kind of like gets to the core of it.
I fully agree. And this follows up with a question to Josh about breaking rules or conventions in art to inspire change. So actually breaking artistic formal rules in exhibition settings, institutions to inspire change, and how you work with that process, feel about that process, enact that process.
I think a lot about it. I've been working on an essay about it for the last like 12 years. I will someday finish it. I think there are some issues in art and in the academy as well that are hindering like efforts at both climate justice but also political transformation in a country like the United States that I could go on and on about. They're related to like the rise of the avant-gardes in the like 1950s and 1960s and a kind of cultural secession that took place among not just artists but like all sorts of thinkers, writers, other people making things in mid-century, not just America, but the West. And I think what it comes down to is that there has been a kind of disengagement among artists and thinkers from society and a kind of turning away from like working people and people who don't have like very expensive arts educations. And I think, as much of a fan, as big of a fan of, difficult conceptual art from the 1970s as I am, I love a long, like, Bruce Nauman performance video. Like, I think maybe the time has come to, as artists who, if you want to re-engage with society, to think about formal issues and to think about, like, communication, in a way to, like, maybe learn something from cinema and, like, filmmaking, like, which is, what are the issues that I want to communicate about, and can I communicate about these issues through art, and how do I go about that, and like where do I start? And starting from like a kind of empathy with the audience rather than thinking about just the self, like what do I need to provide to open up the art that I'm making to people who can't afford like $200,000 of like expensive arts education, and like how do I keep the work rigorous and complex and meaningful while doing that? And I think that's a challenge that for me as an artist feels very rich and meaningful in the present.
I have to say, in working with Josh on this symposium and on the Mass Displacement and Climate Refugee Symposium last year at the Whitney, like you do have very rigorous standards while wanting the work to be very accessible. And I really appreciate as a colleague getting to work with your mind with that commitment you have.
I always try and remember, I didn't learn that contemporary art existed until my 5th year of undergrad. Like, I just didn't know. I thought that painting and sculpture had ended in the 60s with Warhol, and I was shocked. I was shocked to learn that it was still going. And so, you know, like, I think it's, for me, like, I always try and remember that most people in America have no idea that contemporary art exists. And, like, I think it's a good position as an artist to come from, to think about that. Like, if you're making things, whether about the climate or about anything else, like, how do you engage with a public that has not been educated about art?
Yeah, I think as Peter was saying, also sometimes you do things like that, like you talk, right? This is a question, that was a great answer, Josh, and whoever asked that, thank you. 247. Justin, this is a question for you in terms of your work with solutions frameworks and philanthroactivism and investment. Peter mentioned that 80% of the problem is fossil fuels and about 20% is largely industrial meat agriculture, namely cows. In terms of work with landscapes and waterways, fresh waterways, systems of flow in terms of energy and fuel, how shifting away from a meat economy, how good would that be for the space of nature? And what should we do at home? What should we eat? You know, what's a good thing to eat? Is it fish? I don't know.
Great question. And actually, part of what we're doing with the project with Vibrant Data Labs is we're doing additional streams of research and analysis to really come up with robust impact scores for all of the solutions pillars and then the individual solutions pathways, so that when we launch that report, there's going to be some really great insights that eventually can become things that we throw out in the media and activists can, you know, kind of use to hold people accountable. But that's going to give us a much greater sense of what is the full lever behind this particular solution, and how much of a difference would it make for us to completely switch off a meat diet. Based on the holistic kind of framework that we've built, we think that there's an opportunity to do something. We haven't even talked about this publicly yet, but a planetarian diet, where if everybody made the commitment to reduce their meat eating to 1 day per week, and the rest of the week was a vegetarian-based diet, you'd see really profound change and impact, both for nature, for the transport sector. It goes on and on and on and on. We're not at the point yet where I can tell you the rest of the frame for a planetarian diet. But obviously, some people are going to go all vegetarian. Some people are not going to be able to commit to, you know, a full vegetarian diet. But even just doing these kind of commitments where you're reducing your meat consumption, where you're buying locally, where you're making sure that you're getting all of your food and your produce from local growers, that you make sure that if you have the yard space or you have a balcony, you're doing what you can to grow your own food so that you're connecting to nature, so that you understand life systems. Those things are all meaningful. So I guess I would encourage you to check out the solutions framework piece of regenerative agriculture and really start to look through those solution sets and the stories about them, because you know, we've moved way past vote with your dollar, change your light bulb, buy an electric car. Those kind of old tropes really annoy me because they kind of simplify it down into something that feels, I don't know, like a trope, something that's not going to really affect change. We're in a moment where you have to think much more holistically about our life and how we want to change it, how we want to center nature, how we want to center place, how we want to center community. And we can do that by how we source our food, how we use transportation, the policies that we support. We have to think holistically about this. So anyway, check out the website, and there's more information about kind of specific solution sets and also related to regenerative agriculture and food.
Thank you. That moves us perfectly into the next question, and we're going to wrap in a few minutes because of everyone's time. But what is the single most important thing that we can do as individuals to help? And the person asking specifically asked if you could each say one sentence. So just to recap, the single most important thing that people today, tomorrow, can do to help when they go home, when they go to work. And can you each say one sentence with a green heart?
I'm happy to start. I think it's really important to call for systemic change, right? To me, the issues at hand are the systems that shape who has access to, locally produced food or food that's produced in a sustainable way, who has access to affordable green energy. So, we can take these choices in our own life if we have access to those resources, but not everybody has that, right? And it is really incredibly important to call for systemic change and for that change to be just, so that people in the communities that we're part of all have access to that. And the way that's done is through systemic change, calling for policy change.
Thank you. Thank you, Aradhna. Ed, your sentence.
Very simply, call for the end of underpricing of nature and put the money that's saved back into people.
Thank you.
This is gonna sound airy-fairy, but hear me out for a minute. Put down your phones, turn off your television, go outside, put your feet on the ground, and be in nature. And listen.
Thank you.
I'd say the best thing you could do, is do some serious soul searching and find a way to show up as a climate activist in a creative and unique and powerful way, semicolon. Let love and risk be your guide. Embrace love, embrace risk. It's gonna feel risky.
Oh my God, this is going to be so boring after the last ones, but I guess I'm just going to put a pitch in for voting and electoral democracy. I think America has such an outsized impact on the climate crisis, and most of the world does not get to vote in American elections. And so I think it's important to take that aspect of our political system seriously and engage with it, and to vote for people who want to do things about the climate crisis.
Thank you. So again, everyone's voice to be heard. A question popped up: how many years or gigatons of CO2 do we have left to 1.5 Celsius? If we've already passed that, how much until 2 Celsius? So just time. You can measure it in years or gigatons of carbon.
You're the climate scientist.
Yeah, okay, so right now we're increasing at about 0.2 of a degree Celsius every 10 years, although in the last year and a half, there's some really unsettling new data, which I'm not sure that that's gonna keep tracking, and I'm not sure that the forest sink is gonna keep operating as it has been in the past. But we're, depending on how you measure it, 2023 was about 1.4 degrees Celsius above the 1850 to 1900 average. If you look at like a 10-year running mean, I guess we're at about 1.3. We're emitting about 45 gigatons every year. I think the IPCC a few years ago had a couple hundred gigatons left before 1.5, so that's probably, you can kind of do the math. If we're at 1.3 now, then we've got maybe 10 years if we're lucky at this level even. But in the next 5 years, I'd be really surprised if we don't have a year where the average is 1.5 over the 1850 to 1900 mean. So we're basically right on the edge. And then there's other issues too, even if it's a complicated question. When you were talking, Justin, I kind of wanted to talk to you about how you guys calculated this, because I feel like 100% renewables by 2050 probably isn't fast enough to keep us. Even if we shut off really, really fast, which is something you can't do because everyone would die if you turned off fossil fuel overnight. But even if you did that, I think there's some chance the error bars on you have much cleaner air, right? So you have less aerosol pollution, and that could even raise things by a couple of tenths of a degree.
If the U.S. miraculously stopped emissions today, would that be enough? Is that how big our contribution is?
If the U.S.?
U.S. Just no more emissions. Would there be a stabilization?
That's a good, interesting. I usually think about this as a global thing. So no, if the U.S. stopped, I hate to say something that Trump is always saying, but there's still China and other countries too. So one solution that hasn't come up, which is really important, there's a bunch of people working on something really smart called the Global fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty. I think it should get changed to like the fossil fuel ending treaty or something like that, because I think we're still expanding fossil fuels, which drives me insane, but we're kind of past the point where we should be talking about, not expanding and rapidly ramping down. But we definitely need global international cooperation, some kind of a treaty. Again, it's how do we, when you have these ultra billionaires in charge of our national leaders, so they're the ones in some sense kind of really calling the shots right now. Yeah, we got to fix that first, and then we can get these treaties.
Yeah, we have a great follow-up on that, and this is a great question. With this in mind, let's say the government did create taxes or price control subsidies. How can the government prevent gas and oil companies from passing those funding measures on to consumers, essentially taxing the consumers if they get taxed, especially low-income individuals, and keep fuel affordable? Would price controls or subsidies be effective?
Well, there's two things, there's two parts to that answer. One is that you can't stop them from doing it, but you can penalize them for doing it. We have the laws in place to stop price gouging and stuff, and we need more laws, and that it's a big problem. But let's be clear. If we tax the main emitters, there will be higher prices for all of us because we all consume fossil fuels. So just simply because the price goes up. Now, having said that, what should happen is that the prices of, let's say, gasoline for people have worked out, for this country, if we impose a $75 tax on carbon, that should translate into about 75 cents higher price per gallon. Now, what would that mean for the average consumer? Well, for most of us, that's how the price has been fluctuating, in the last 5 years. But if we rebated some of those taxes as income dividends, that'd be well within the household budget. It would even out. So most people could afford it. Now, there are people who are really vulnerable to those type of price changes, and we ought to make sure the money goes back to them even more, or rebates other things. So there's a way to get around it. But we have the laws to stop price gouging.
Yeah,
we just need to enforce them.
With this in mind, yeah, please.
Yeah, I just want to add to that because, for example, that Senate bill in California that I mentioned, there in fact was testimony from legal scholars that established that there's already a legal framework in place. There are laws already on the books to prevent that from happening. Yeah. And also on the economic side of things, some of those funds, I think 40% of all the funds are supposed to go to economically disadvantaged communities in the state. So again, to ensure that there could be a just transition in place.
Yeah, and speaking more to Ed's work, this notion of carbon budgets, right? We have financial budgets with all things we do. Our life has a financial budget. So the concept of creating a carbon budget is essentially that you don't just emit as much carbon emissions as you want. If you have an exhibition, you limit how much carbon emissions you make and such. The Environmental Council here has an advisor, Lucas Yapa, who for a while was the first chief environmental officer of Microsoft, which is a company that has a carbon emissions outlay of about the size of the country of Sri Lanka. Very intense. And as their first CEO, he started doing what Ed was speaking about earlier, which was internal carbon pricing. So Microsoft owns many internal companies, and those divisions are charged an internal carbon price, I think at the time it was about $15 per metric ton for their own emissions. And part of the reason they started charging themselves was to try to reduce their carbon emissions as an incentive. We have 2 questions in, and we're going to make them shorter. And I'm going to put them together in the sense of one, what is wealth redistribution as a climate solution? And there was a really smart question that came in terms of urban planning. How important is our urban planning systems in terms of transit and density? How important is that as a climate solution? So we have wealth and urban planning. If anyone would like to speak to either, wealth redistribution and urban planning.
As for urban planning, just a fun thing you could do is get Cory Doctorow's new book, Lost Cause. It's really kind of interesting take on how urban planning might be helpful. It's a fiction book.
I mean, urban planning is such an exciting field actually in this moment, especially in megacities, because we have to redesign how urban centers are serving people and all people, and we have to redesign them in a way that centers climate. And so there's a whole array of things that need to be done, everything from energy efficiency to redesigning our transportation systems to including, to including green spaces, to including, corridors for wildlife and species and pollinators to continue to thrive. To me, it's an incredibly exciting proposition to think about how you would transform an urban landscape. And there's great examples of it happening, even here in LA.
And I think that wealth redistribution is fundamental, actually, to the issues we've been talking about. When people can afford sustainable, locally grown food, they go for this. When people can afford land access, that is key. That's something that comes up time and time and time again.
Just wanted to quickly say that, we've touched on this a lot. There's a lot of ways that climate injustice is related to all the other forms of oppression that people around the world have been experiencing for hundreds of years under extractive colonial capitalism. But if you look at things like the housing crisis, right, affordable housing, if you look at the healthcare crisis, if you look at all of these different ways in which people in this country and people overseas are just being just absolutely ground down under these systems, right? The common denominator in all of them is billionaires getting richer and richer and richer, where everyone else can barely live, and in some cases can't live anymore. And this is gonna accelerate. We've been seeing heat waves, and we've been seeing storms and floods and wildfires and massive smoke events. One thing that is going to start coming real soon, and it's been kind of a little bit under the surface of the noise, at least in the United States so far, are crop failures. And that's going to, I think that's going to start to drive a lot of sort of famine and basically suffering and death amongst the poorest people globally.
And for those who were here earlier, Rong was really speaking to that in terms of drought, and Mark was speaking to the notion of the consumer capitalism epic genre as to how we've gotten to this place. Lastly, Ram mentioned 2030, the number 2030. We've been hearing this a lot as being a time when it's sort of our deadline. Is that too late? And do we have any capacity to meet that? And as we speak to this, what is your feeling going forward? Because we're in a motion of solutions and strategy. And to me, looking at Josh's series of works in the exhibition upstairs, you see causes, effects, solution, strategy, but also narrative. So as you think forward in a narrative sense, what is your thoughts in terms of that question?
So when we look at New Orleans and the impacts of Hurricane Katrina, we see now, decades later, there's still parts of the city, communities haven't recovered, right? When we imagine what's happening right now in North Carolina, right, in Florida, even after 15, 20 years, we're gonna see that there are parts of impacted areas, both rural and urban, that will not have recovered. You think about Paradise, the city that burned to the ground, the town that burned to the ground. And so I would say that in some places, right, there are communities that are already experiencing scars of what's happened. 2030 feels like it's quite far away. In fact, I think we need to be acting now. All we're gonna see with respect to climate change is that it's gonna continue to accelerate.
I think, it's really hard to put a specific date, but certainly if by 2030 we don't see a sufficient change in policies so that the curve of fossil fuel-driven emissions doesn't start to fall, then I think we are in serious trouble. So, I'm not entirely sure we're going to get there. Depends a lot what happens in the next few weeks here. It depends a lot what happens in other elections in other parts of the world, because there's a lot of countries that are very much vested in fossil fuels, not just ours. But yes, unless we start to see the fossil fuel emissions start to bend significantly by 2030, I think we're in trouble, because carbon stays up there in the atmosphere for a long time, as Peter says.
Yeah, so I'm actually really strongly opposed to these kinds of framings of there's like a date by, like when we lose everything, because that's just not how it works. The bad news is every single day it's getting a little bit worse, and it's effectively irreversible. Like how hot it gets is basically how hot it's going to stay for the rest of our lives, and probably the rest of our kids' lives and their kids' lives. So that's and then every little day's worth of extra heat takes us closer to like a lot of really huge tipping points, but they're not global tipping points, but they're bad things like the ocean circulations changing, shutting down, losing the Amazon rainforest, losing the coral reefs, which is something that I've studied. So that's the bad news. The good news is it's never too late, and we got to keep fighting these bastards till the very end. Really, like, it just breaks. It's just so strange to me that these, I pick on the CEOs. It's also the finance bros and the lobbyists and the Wall Street class and, the airline executives that are pushing these narratives of like putting up. I wish I could swear. I've been about to swear so many times, but I'm not going to.
I don't think YouTube censors.
Well, anyway, sort of forgot what I was going to say, but yeah.
Good.
I was just gonna say, it's interesting to be in this dialogue with such like a diverse kind of array of skill sets and approaches and ways that each of these people are driving change and are committed to climate action. I think it's possible to hold two sides of the same coin together, meaning you can get fired up and angry and motivated to stop the bad stuff, the bad actors, the people who need to be held accountable, and you can get energy from that. But at the same time, you have to hold the other side of the coin, which is the possibility that we can solve this. And by solve this, I mean redefine how humanity is currently living on this planet and living together. And you have to hold an image of what's possible. And the thing for me that has fed me with so much hope about what is possible beyond what the science or the data or the numbers show is having had the privilege of working with so many communities around the world, frontline communities, who are faced with the most atrocious impacts from climate and from bad actors, and seeing what happens when you work in partnership, you give space for them to lead the way to drive the solutions that they know that their communities need, and you watch them build power. And so part of what we do on our website is we have something called the One Earth Navigator, and we are identifying amazing projects that are implementing local solutions and supporting them with storytelling. And what's powerful about seeing this roadmap of organizations, leaders, heroes, communities that are driving change is that you suddenly get a sense of an alternate narrative that's actually happening, that is a movement that is building that is going to change this. And you need to plug into that while at the same time holding the anger and the energy for holding everything else accountable for the bad stuff that's happening.
I think this is trying to teach us something as a species, and I hope that we learn the lesson in the next 10 or 20 years, and if we don't, I'm sure we will in the next million or couple million years, but hopefully we'll learn it quickly enough to save a lot of what can still be saved. But it's basically that we have to help each other and stop with this hoarding and stop with this and come down to earth. Be grateful for this planet, which is the only one that we know of so far in the universe that has life, and find this joy in each other and in the trees and not in, I guess, the rapid consumerism, the wanting more and more stuff.
Yeah, and today. Final question. I wanted to circle to Alessia's talk, who began Effects today, where she was talking about narrative, personal experience working with moms in the LA Basin area, and how a narrative of actual stories of care, connection, and growth can teach us the mega picture from each individual story. So narrative and what you do today and tomorrow, how you tell your friends, what you talk about, what you change personally. Josh closed last year's Whitney Symposium talking about force multiplier. You know, bring a friend, bring two. I know when I changed to renewables off of coal and my electricity, like I brought my neighbors. Like you start from where you are and you start from your own stories, and that's how we can at least live. Do you want to have a final thing?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't have that much to add to what you've already said, other than, you know, I could go on and on about taxes as an existing form of wealth distribution, a mechanism that already exists that we can vote for. And also to go back to voting, to say, you know, with the election so close, that there really is a difference between like the two options on hand. You know, like if Trump becomes president, like it's going to really set back like climate mitigation efforts substantially. And so, you know, I know there are a lot of people, particularly on the left, who are not voting, you know, who claim they're not going to vote for various reasons that I'm not going to argue with today. But I think it is important to think about like the consequences of American government policy, and like this is something that people can do. And also, I want to end just saying something about urgency, which is something else that's come up repeatedly today. You know, there's an argument that's made that, oh, you know, we mustn't scare people about the climate crisis. We mustn't scare people. But actually, I think we do need to scare people. Like, people need to feel that this is an urgent issue. And it's not something that's far away in the future. It's something that, as we've all been discussing, is happening right now. And it's just going to get worse unless real substantial action is taken. Direct action on the part of individuals, but also systemic action, which is generated through government policies. So I'd urge everybody to think about that, you know, moving forward in your lives.
Thank you, Josh. Thank you to our speakers. Thank you to MOCA, and thank you to all of you for being here today.
Yes, thank you, and thank you, Haley. Thank you, Haley, for organizing today's amazing symposium. Thank you, David. Thank you, Johanna, Lisa, Rebecca, everyone at MOCA, Kelsey, for all your tireless work on this. And thank you to all the speakers. Another round of applause for everybody who's been speaking today. Thank you so much.
So thank you all very much for coming. On behalf of MOCA, thank you. The panelists are amazing. Josh, you're obviously terrific, both the exhibition and the panel organization. Johanna, Lisa, Kelsey, from the bottom of my heart, thank you so much. A great, great day. But really, the special thanks, the reason I came up, is to make sure to thank Haley. What an amazing, amazing thing you've done, not only today, but for the Environmental Council generally. It's honestly been one of the great privileges of my life to have an opportunity to work with you. I know it will continue, and we so appreciate everything. I personally appreciate it, and everyone at MOCA so much appreciates all that you've done for MOCA, but also for the environment generally. So thank you so much.